joining us. We're trying to do this little hybrid thing here tonight. Hopefully it will work out well for us and will allow us to reach more members in the future just by doing it this way. So let's welcome everybody. Okay, so tonight we have a couple things here. Sorry, I'm reading notes, so it's all new to me. It's been so long. I want to introduce a new member that has joined us recently. Laura, back in the back. We met at Mars School. So Laura, you want to just say something, introduce yourself to the group? Yep.
Laura, live in Happy Grace, Maryland, and been doing photography off and on while raising kids.
All right.
But I want to get my business really more full-time now, that they can go off on their own.
I've been on that street with the kids part.
Yeah, they don't need me as much, so.
So welcome aboard.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Welcome to the world, Laura. And I'll tell you that to benefit your membership, these people in this room are here to help you. So make sure you reach out to them. Whenever you need something, we're here to help you. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right. All right. So some announcements. Next month we are having our print competition, which will be virtual. We are not going to be live in person for that. That will be done on Zoom. Lydia has asked me to remind you guys that there are changes for the print competition, so please read the emails that she has sent out. We are allowing 2 free restoration images to kind of bolster that category. And if you guys want to, please enter those. They are free. It goes towards, you won't get, how can I explain this? This is probably going to be wrong. You're not going to get points, thank you, George, points for it. But at least we'll help you understand the category and get people involved in that category.
Danny, I thought it only said reportage was that way. Yeah. It didn't say that about restoration.
I stand corrected.
Yeah. But I mean,
read the email.
Unless it was not.
The email is very long and explains it all. So read. Thank you. I apparently didn't read it, so it's all good.
I would trust Chris on that.
I think it's also on the pre-competition web page on our website.
Yeah. So it's been a while since we've done this, so it's all good. It's all live. So just check your emails frequently, because I think tonight coming up here we had several people that needed Zoom links, and I think we had sent emails out over and over again. So please check your emails frequently for all of our announcements and all those good things. So next month's print competition, August, we're planning something for probably a get-together, just a cookout kind of thing, but we're working on that now. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So it's great to be back live. Thank you guys for showing up in person. All 10 of you. No, more than that. But thank you guys for showing up. So I am pleased to finally introduce somebody live and in person. This is the title of this program tonight is Must Know Legal Issues for Business Owners That Are Photographers. And with that, I'm going to let the floor open for Katherine. This is Katherine Taylor. Thank you, Katherine, for showing up.
Thank you. Hi there. So my biography was in the invitation or the announcement. I won't go over that in detail, but I did want to just mention, Laura, to your note, I did kind of the part-time lawyer thing for a lot of years too, and then finally was able to go into full-time practicing law. So I've been a business lawyer representing small businesses for about 15 years. Before that, I was a lawyer for the Howard County Office of Law for 10 years, doing a variety of work, and then before that, I was a commercial litigator at a law firm in Baltimore. But yes, for the last 15 years, my specialty, let's say, has been representing small business owners and doing real estate work. So I also love photography, and I was reminded by my husband tonight that I'm a professional photographer because I sold an image for $2 on IM.
I did one better. I sold my first one about
So I guess that makes me professional.
Yeah.
But no, I was really excited when Bruce asked me to do this presentation because I love photography. I love being with my camera, taking it wherever I go, and trying things out. And I love going into camera shops and looking on the B&H photo catalog. So hopefully with kindred spirits. Okay, so when we were talking about what this was going to be about, I said to Bruce that I didn't want it to be intellectual property. Because, you know, if you Google photographer legal issues, most of what you're going to find are, you know, articles about copyright, intellectual property, releases, and that sort of thing. What I'm going to do is really get into the kind of the business side of it, and that's why I call it must-know legal issues for business owner photographers. Because even if you don't believe you're a business owner, if you are a photographer and holding yourself out as such, as a professional photographer and doing work for clients, you're running a business. So hopefully some of what I go over will be applicable. Not all of it will be applicable to you. You may hear some things that you've never heard before. You may hear some things you have heard before. If you have questions, I think we have enough time. Go ahead and raise your hand, during the presentation, but we'll definitely save room at the end for questions. So just in general, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over entity formation. That's basically choice of entity, what an entity is, the types of entities you can choose, the pros and cons of those entities, and also the taxation, because the taxation, we're not going to get into a whole bunch of tax law, but the taxation of the entities is the main reason why people may choose one form over another. And then we're going to get into some of the steps you really have to take after you form an entity to make sure that your business is just kind of on the ground level, ready to go. And then I'm going to discuss some regulatory and licensing issues that you may need to know about, some common contracts that you're probably going to need to have, and then I'm going to go over at the very end 2 new, I'll say, areas of law, or 2 new laws, I should say, regarding sales tax. One is the Wayfair case, which you guys might have read about a couple of years ago, and the second one is House Bill 932, which was passed by Maryland and really just became effective, I think, within the last 18 months, and makes a change to how photographers are required to charge tax on their work and their products. All right, so here we go. I always do this when I talk about entities, because what is so important about why you form an entity is that an entity is basically like a person. It is like a separate legal person. And what that means is that when you form an entity, you're not the entity. The entity is that legal fiction, and it's that entity that does business. It's that entity that enters into contracts. It's that entity that hopefully is absorbing all of the potential liability that you, as the owner of that entity, want to avoid, and that's the reason you form an entity in the first place. So, I put up here the definition of an entity. It's a separate legal person. In many statutes, in many federal and state statutes, person is many times defined as an individual, human being, corporation, partnership, limited liability, etc. So it really is a legal person when you form an entity. So what laws apply to the formation of an entity and the operation of an entity? Basically state law. Every state in the country has a different set of corporate and limited liability company laws. So the first thing you have to do to form your entity is abide by state law. But you're also going to be bound by tax law when you choose how your entity is going to be taxed. And so that's kind of where the state law and federal laws kind of mush together, and you just have to kind of be able to look at it all and synthesize it all and figure out what is the best way for you to do business. Okay, let's talk about the most common type of entity. That is an LLC. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. So an LLC is really kind of a hybrid between a corporation and a partnership. Way back in the days when we didn't even have a constitution, there was a form of entity called a charter. And basically what that was is where the colonies or the states at that time would grant a person the right to do business, so that the person could do business through a charter and not be personally liable for the debts of the business. And so that type of entity kind of became what we call corporations today. And the corporation has been around in most state laws for hundreds of years. An LLC is actually a very new type of entity when you look at the relative age of the sets of laws that we're dealing with. The LLC in Maryland has only been around about 25 years or so. In fact, when I went to law school, there was no such thing as an LLC. And so, I kind of took courses learning only really about corporations. And when I formed my entity 15 years ago, I formed a corporation because at the time, LLCs were kind of untested. This idea of limited liability for LLC owners was a little untested, and so, being a lawyer, I kind of went the safe route and did the corporation. Now I would probably form an LLC rather than a corporation. But let's go, so as I said, the LLC is like a combination between a corporation and a partnership. A partnership is basically just more than one person who agree to do business together. It's a very loosey-goosey kind of relationship. You don't have to have a written agreement to have an actual partnership. You can have a written agreement, and you frankly should, but you don't have to. So you go from a very loosey-goosey kind of partnership to a corporation, which is very regulated. Every state statute is very, very detailed relating to what is required to form a corporation, how a corporation is going to be run, what the stockholders' powers are, what the board's powers are. LLC is that middle-of-the-road compromise, basically, that many state laws, now all the states in the United States, have put into place to allow really people like us, small business owners, to not have to go through all of the corporate formalities, but be able to still have some of the attributes of a corporation, which is primarily the limited liability. So what do we mean by limited liability? Do you all know what that means? So that basically what that means is if you're doing business as an entity and the entity is sued, let's say, or incurs a huge debt, that claimant or the plaintiff can't come after you and your assets, your house, your car, your bank accounts. They can only go after the assets of the business. So usually the assets of the business, our business is probably, you all have a lot of equipment, probably expensive equipment. I don't even have that. I've got a couple computers, some books that are probably outdated, and a bank account. That's pretty much the assets that I have. And so if my entity got sued, that's all a creditor could get. They couldn't get my house, my car, my 401k plan, and my dog.
Catherine,
yeah.
There's a question in the chat about, somebody asked if an LLC was for people who make $50,000 or less. Is there any kind of financial thing?
None whatsoever. Okay. There's no distinction. There are LLCs. One, Subway is owned by Doctors Associates LLC. I don't know if you know that. It was formed years ago by a bunch of doctors. And it's an LLC, so that's a huge company. It's a franchise. And, to as small as a one-person, a one-owner LLC. So no monetary levels that you have to deal with. Okay, so there's one caveat to the liability. Well, a couple caveats. If your business goes out to get a loan or signs a commercial lease you may be asked as the owner to sign a personal guarantee. Now, why is that? It's because the bank isn't going to lend to an LLC that's only making, maybe $100,000 a year. They might not want to lend $500,000, or a commercial landlord might not want to take the risk that that business is going to stay in business and be able to pay the rent. So they're going to ask for personal guarantees. In those situations, you as a person, you as an individual can be liable for those debts. But those are debts that you sign directly. They're not necessarily debts of they're debts of the entity and of you personally. And it's something that you're asked separately to do. You don't have to do it. Probably won't get the lease if you don't do it, or the loan. But it's not a necessary result of having an LLC or a corporation. Okay, how do you form an LLC? An LLC and a corporation are formed pretty much the same way. There's a little bit more information that you need when you file articles of incorporation to form a corporation. But to form an LLC, how many of you have formed LLCs, by the way? Okay, so most of you, and the ones that haven't, have you formed corporations? Okay, and the ones that haven't formed an LLC or a corporation, you will, right? And after tonight, you'll know exactly how to do it. And you can always call me if you have a question. So basically, to form an LLC, it's really easy. You can go in Maryland, you can go onto the State Department of Assessments and Taxation website, fill out the form. It's called Articles of Organization. And the only information that you need is the name of the organizer. An organizer needs to be somebody 18 years or older who is a resident of Maryland. So it can be your son, your neighbor, your lawyer, anybody. A purpose, you have to have a purpose statement. It can be a very broad purpose statement. It could just, it could just say to do photography. That's plenty. You have to have a resident agent and a resident agent address. And this is probably the most important thing. The resident agent is basically a person, which can also be a corporation, that is located in Maryland, resident in Maryland, and has an address in Maryland. So that if you're sued, that's where the lawsuit gets sent. That's really the main reason for the resident agent. And the principal office. You have to have a principal office in Maryland. There's a lot of controversy about this now because, so many people are remote workers and work from their home, and a lot of people don't want to use their home address as their principal office address. I've had a number of clients. We formed a lot of entities over the last year. And a lot of people just don't want to use their home address, and so they're going out and getting business suites, addresses. You can't use a P.O. box, and you can't use like a Mailbox USA or a UPS box. It has to be an address, like with a person that gets the mail. I don't see much of a problem with using your home address, if that's the only address you have, unless you're, conducting some highly classified work, or you want to remain anonymous. In that case, then you can talk about other options. Okay, so when you file those articles with the state of Maryland, with your fee, you will get, hopefully within 5 to 7 days, if you pay the extra $50, an approval letter saying your LLC has been formed. You're now official. What do you do next? If you have an LLC, I always recommend, even if it's a sole member LLC, that you have an operating agreement. An operating agreement is basically the agreement among the members of the LLC or the owners, that basically talks about and governs who does what, who runs the business, how profits are going to be split, what happens if somebody dies, becomes incapacitated, divorces, goes into bankruptcy, all those things. Now, I used to tell people that were forming single-member LLCs that they really didn't need an operating agreement. And that really is kind of true, because it's kind of like you're doing an agreement with yourself. But when you go to the bank to open an account, most likely, depends on the bank, but the bank is probably going to ask you for your operating agreement, and so you might as well just have an operating agreement. When we form LLCs, we always include an operating agreement for a single member LLC. An operating agreement for a multi-member LLC is a little more complicated, it's a little more expensive, but we always include that as part of our service. If you do this on your own online, if you're a single member LLC, I usually tell people, you know what, it's okay to go on to LegalZoom or Rocket Lawyer and get a single member operating agreement. Do not, however, do that if you're a multi-member LLC. It gets much more complicated and you can really screw things up if you just use a form that is not meant for a more complex situation. So you've got your LLC formed, you've got your operating agreement. As I said, the good thing about an LLC is the management structure is very, very flexible. There are few restrictions on who can be a member of an LLC, and the sharing of profits and losses is very flexible. Did I just? Yeah. Okay. We're going to not talk too much about taxation, but I'm going to throw out a couple of phrases because you've probably heard this. You've probably heard a couple of these phrases with regard to the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. I just say the 2017 Tax Act. So generally, an LLC is a pass-through entity. What that means is that unless you elect otherwise, the profits and losses of that business flow through or pass through that entity to the owners or the members. So if you're a single member LLC and you haven't chosen to be taxed as a sub-S corporation, then you probably file a Schedule C. If you're a multi-member LLC, then you probably file a partnership tax return, and then you have K-1s given to each of the members. If you've elected sub-S status, you'll file a Form 1120, which is a corporate tax return with K-1s to the individual members. So what do I mean by filing as either a partnership or a corporation when you're an LLC? This is where the term disregarded entity comes into play. So the IRS does not consider, for tax purposes, an LLC to exist. There's no such thing as an LLC in the tax code. So what the IRS says is, well, we got to tax these somehow, so how are we going to tax them? So we're going to tax an LLC if it doesn't choose something different as a disregarded entity. We're going to pretend that the LLC doesn't exist, basically, right? And so everything's going to flow down to the members. But if you want, LLC owners, you can choose to be taxed as a corporation. And you can also choose to be taxed as an S corporation, which gets even more confusing because an S corporation is an election that a corporation makes to be treated more like a pass-through entity. So it's kind of like you start as a pass-through, then you choose the sub-S corporate, then you're going to still be a pass-through. But the biggest point here is don't make this decision yourself. Talk to your accountant. I always suggest, even if you just have a small business, that you have an accountant who is experienced with small businesses and with individuals. Because if you're a pass-through entity, that accountant's going to need to know kind of like both sides to be able to advise you of strategies that you might want to do personally and business-wise, be able to advise you as to the best way to be taxed. So my corporation is taxed as an S-corp, which means it's a flow-through, pass-through entity. And that, decision was made by talking to my accountant. Yes?
So you get to take the advantage of the LLC as kind of a shield for liability, but then for financial purposes of taxation, you get to be basically a sole proprietorship? I mean, you get to like kind of behave like that is just not
Correct.
coming to you?
If you're a single member LLC, it's almost just like being a sole proprietorship for tax purposes. Right, right. And here's an important thing, and I guess, if you're a lawyer, you it just kind of comes natural, but, tax law and state law, they're two completely separate things. Your liability for claims, the way the LLC is going to be managed, any disputes among members of an LLC or corporation, that's all going to be governed under state law. Tax is obviously federal law, and it's completely separate, almost like two separate bodies of knowledge that don't necessarily rely on each other. So for instance, if we had a claim against an LLC, let's say, and the LLC was being taxed as, chose to be taxed as a partnership for tax purposes, we couldn't claim, oh, well, we're going to treat these LLC members as general partners. No, it doesn't work that way. It's only for tax purposes. That's where the accountants really come into play.
I have a question. Might be all target and all that.
That's okay.
Became an LLC back in 2017.
Uh-huh.
Did everything what I thought at the time was correct.
Right.
Then I got hit by the Department of Taxation and all that. You owe $600 because I didn't pay the annual
Exactly.
tax of the $300.
Right.
And I guess my question was, at that time, why is it so much? Because I talked with various people from other states. I'm not going to mention one particular name, but some of you all do know. He said he only paid like $80.
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out, is that something geared towards just the state of
Right.
Maryland that is so high? Because
Right.
they hit me with,
So-
taxes and everything.
So this is my favorite story, right? And not to get into politics, but there's one side of the aisle that always says no new taxes, right? So back in not this administration, Republican administration, but several administrations ago, it was the Ehrlich administration. State needed to raise money. I guess the state was running out of money, right? Like states always do. But they didn't raise taxes. They had fees. And all of a sudden, you started getting these $300 bills just to file your personal property tax return. It's not even a tax that you pay. It is a fee for the privilege of filing your annual report and your personal property tax return, right? So that's $300 per entity, thank you, per year. And if you don't file the return, or if you don't pay those personal property taxes, then your charter, that is, your approval to do business in the state can be forfeited. And in order to get that back, you have to pay the back taxes, you might have to pay a penalty, and then you have to file, if it's gotten far enough where they've actually revoked the charter, then you have to file what are called articles of revival. Got it. And it's very expensive, right?
My scenario, I did not know, but I talked with various people, consultants, and all that get set up. And then it all came at one time, but this Department of Taxation said it wasn't that they were trying to pick on you.
Right. No.
It just happened to come up, and just came up at one time. And it took me a couple of months.
Yes, it can take a long time to get. In fact, we're working on a matter now where it's a corporation, the charter was forfeited, and something got lost in the works, and we can't figure out who we need to talk to. I mean, it's just a mess. So just as an aside, when I worked for Howard County, interestingly, the county is charged with collecting personal property taxes from businesses. And so when I worked for the county, I handled all of the bankruptcy cases, and in all the bankruptcy cases we had to go get personal property taxes. I mean, you're not the first one that didn't get that memo, right, and did not file that return and or pay those taxes. Many times, again, you all have expensive equipment, but compared to like a heavy equipment company or construction company, the personal property you have is very low value. You might have even if you have $10,000 to $20,000 worth of equipment or more, some of these larger, construction companies might have millions of dollars worth of equipment. So and that's all personal property. Personal property is anything other than real property. So their personal property taxes are really, really high. Mine is like $176 a year. And so I laugh because it costs me more to file the return than the actual tax. But that's just the way it is.
So in Montgomery County, you have to pay the personal property tax to that.
To Montgomery County?
Yeah.
Well, it's Howard County, you pay it to Howard County.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So the collect the tax for the county and the state. There's a state and a county component, but the collector is the county.
Is the county.
Right, right. Yes.
I was just going to have you, either the answers be complete or repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They can only hear you.
Right, okay,
so
okay.
Yeah, I think they're okay right now, but.
Got it.
just in the future,
Thank
yeah.
you. Sorry, guys. Okay.
Question.
Yes. Yes.
Is there any advantage? I know people incorporate in the state of Delaware, a lot of corporates.
Right.
Is there any advantage to doing that, or are we in that realm, or that's only for biggies?
I'm going to be a little flippant and say there's an advantage if you are a tech startup planning to go public. And the reason is this. So Delaware, so the question was, is there an advantage to incorporating in Delaware? And when you say incorporating, I guess you mean either form an LLC or form a corporation in Delaware. And the answer is yes, but in limited circumstances. Delaware has, for many, many years, had a very favorable corporate statute that was very pro-corporation. And basically what that means is that it doesn't really have anything to do with taxes either. It really just has anything to do with, okay, how are disputes resolved among shareholders? Does a corporation have the right to do blah, 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 blah with regard to its board, that sort of thing. So for a corporation that maybe is going to be multi-state, do business across the country, it's going to have a lot of income, a lot of employees. There are a lot of reasons why a corporation may want to file in Delaware. An LLC in Delaware is not going to be treated much different from an LLC in Maryland because the LLC statutes are fairly similar. And so I wouldn't, and there's one exception to that, and I'm not even going to get into that. It's a weird type of LLC that you can form in Delaware but not in Maryland, but it wouldn't apply to anybody in this room. So I have formed one entity in North Carolina. It was when a client moved to North Carolina, right? So she was located in North Carolina, and one in Delaware, and otherwise all the entities that I formed have been in Maryland.
So the next question is, there are a number of photographers who will be here in our organization who do jobs in Maryland, Virginia, blah, blah,
right,
in multiple states, and some who even get on a plane and will travel out to California or Texas to do corporate work out there.
right.
Do they need to get an LLC in each of those states, or is this covered in the state of Maryland, especially if you end up getting a lawsuit?
Very good question.
In what state do you get sued?
You could probably get sued in all those states. So let me repeat the question. So the question was, if you're a photographer who does business, let's say your entity is formed in Maryland and you live in Maryland, but you go into Pennsylvania, which is very common, right? We're a small state, so we're a border state. Virginia, DC, you get on a plane, you fly to California, fly to Nevada. Where can you be sued? You can be sued in all those states because you go into those states. Do you have to form an LLC or corporation in all of those states? No. However, if you regularly do business in those states, for instance, if you're in Maryland and you regularly go into Pennsylvania, and when I say regularly, maybe once every couple of months, just more than just happenstance, then what you should do is register your Maryland company as a foreign entity. Foreign, not out of the country, but out of the state. So all you have to do is go to the Pennsylvania State Commerce Department website, Florida, wherever you do business, and register your entity, Maryland. You basically say, I have this Maryland LLC or corporation. I want to do business in Pennsylvania. Sign me up. You know, you pay the fee, and then you're registered to do business. So what does that do for you? It allows you to legally do business in that state. So if you're found not to have registered to do business and you get sued, that could be an issue. But basically, what it does is you have to, just like you have to in Maryland, you have to have a resident agent in Pennsylvania, and you have to have a resident agent in any other state. There are companies out there, if you all are doing this, registering in these other states, there are companies that will be a resident agent in almost any state that you need a resident agent. We use a company called Northwest Resident Agents, and if we need a resident agent in any state, they have somebody in every single state that can be a resident agent. So that's really, it's usually like $100 a year for that kind of a service. But yes, you do have to register to do business in that state. Very good question.
So at the outset, you said that, who has an LLC, who doesn't. I expect that by the end of this, the rest of you will be
right.
in the LLC. I'm starting to buy that. But also, are there, since if I just form an LLC, do pass through, so the tax purposes is the same, what else am I changing? What else do I need to change, or what should I expect to change because I form an LLC?
So what you have to do is, I think I have.
Oh, you do.
I thought I did. So one thing you have to do is you have to do business as the entity. So instead of Katherine Taylor, the full name of my corporation is Katherine L. Taylor, PA. So on any contract that I sign, on my website, on my business card, somewhere I'm going to have the name of the formal entity, because basically what you want to do when you have an entity is you have to show to the public that it's the entity they're doing business with and not you personally. If you form an entity and you don't have that entity name on your contracts, you don't have it on, somewhere on your website, your terms of service on your website, and they think they're doing business with Bruce Press and not Bruce Press LLC, then you could be sued separately and individually. So that's why I really like to stress that entity is a person. It's that person that's doing the business. So you have to tell people who they're dealing with, right? Now, what you have to do, when I say open a bank account, that's like the first thing that you do. Well, the first thing you do after you get your entity formed is you get your EIN number, your federal EIN number, which you can get off the IRS website. Then you're going to need your state combined registration number, which is the state counterpart to the federal EIN, and that allows you to have that account number for your sales and use tax, which you're going to have to pay, and also for if you have employees, for withholding and workers' comp and employment-related expenses, I guess. Make sure that your bank account is in the name of your LLC. Don't put it in your personal name. And do not, by any means, commingle funds. If you get a check from, your sister for your birthday, if it's a personal gift, don't put it in your business account. Don't write checks to your daughter out of your business account, if it's a gift. There are ways to get around that if you do, and you can talk to your accountant. You can just, book it as a distribution, but don't commingle funds, because that is one of the things that anybody seeking to what they call pierce the corporate veil, that is get to your personal assets, the first thing they're going to do is look at your bank accounts and see if you've commingled your funds. Don't pay your mortgage. Don't pay your personal expenses out of the business bank account. Keep it separate. I always suggest, no matter how large or small your business is, that you have a bookkeeper. and you know, I'm here saying you need an accountant and a bookkeeper and all those expenses are adding up. But I will tell you that, like, the bookkeeper I have charges $45 an hour. She works for our business. She does work for our business, and we have like 6 or 7 people, and you know, lots of transactions. We have a client trust account, maybe 5 hours a month. So when you think about it, that what, $250 is so worth having somebody who knows exactly how to book all those expenses. All the accounts are reconciled on a monthly basis. The credit card accounts are reconciled. It's all taken care of. And then at the end of the year, we just send the reports to the accountant. We don't have the accountant with, you know, charging accountant rates to enter all of those transactions into QuickBooks. So bookkeeper and or accountant, I think, are very, very important. You know, if you're just doing 1 or 2 clients a week, you can start off without a bookkeeper if you're comfortable with QuickBooks. I tell people I'm a CPA and a lawyer, and I don't do my own books. I can't stand QuickBooks. I don't get it. And so I just feel like it's worth paying somebody, you know, outsourcing that kind of work to somebody who can do it very quickly and do it right the first time.
Another question from the Zoom people.
Okay.
Also a question I have. Ted says, already have an EIN and state registration, but operate as sole proprietor, as Ted Miller Photography, separate bank account, etc. Does all that need to change if I change to an LLC? Meaning, I assume, get a name, because he's probably doing a DBA, and
right.
he probably has a separate bank account. Can that bank account just sort of move over? Does he have to open a new bank account?
You may be able to go to the bank and change the name of the bank account, but I would definitely make sure that the name of the account is in the name of the entity. And in terms of a new EIN, that's a very good question, and I would say just go to the IRS website and see what it says. There's some situations where you don't have to get a new EIN, but I'm not sure about that one. Yes?
I had to do that. Same situation.
Okay, you had to get a new EIN? Okay, so I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I think sometimes trying to transfer an EIN, I had a client do that. They sent a letter to the IRS.
You want to do that anyway.
Who sends a letter to the IRS?
Right. You don't want those. You don't want your other corporation tied into your new corporation.
Right.
So that's another
Right. Question?
Doing business as.
Yes. What is that?
What is that? But so I started the LLC a long time ago.
Okay.
But changed names.
Right.
So that because of the internet or
right.
things like that. So you changed the name, and I filed with the state.
A trade name.
A trade name.
Right.
So I do. Are you limited with as many trade names as you want? Or?
You can have as many trade names as you want. Right.
And they're all tied back.
And make sure. Okay. So what is it? So the question is, can you have more than one trade name? But let me first explain what a trade name is. I was going to mention that, I think, at some point. If you go back to, well, if you saw the first screen, it has Taylor Legal. That's a trade name. That's a registered trade name for Katherine L. Taylor, PA. You know, Katherine L. Taylor, PA is like, you're right, internet, you know, doesn't look that great on the website or cards. So I wanted a logo and a short name. So what you do is you can register that trade name. Remember how I said when you have an entity name, you have to let the public know who they're doing business with. When you have a trade name, you have to let the public know who they're doing business with. So if somebody does business with Taylor Legal, now I'm still going to have all of my contracts in my formal corporate name. The Taylor Legal is really just more like a brand. But, you know, if somebody would go to my website, they don't see Katherine L. Taylor, PA, they just see Taylor Legal. If they look up Taylor Legal in the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation database, they'll see that that trade name is owned by my corporation. It should be owned by your entity and not by you personally, okay? Because that trade name liability will tie back to the owner of the trade name. Really easy to file a trade name. They renew, I think you have to renew every 5 years. It's not expensive. And yes, you can have many. You know, people have many different divisions, right? I have a colleague who is Frost Tax Law, Frost Tax Attorneys, I mean, whatever, you know.
I just came up with one the other day. I mean,
Right.
I just came up with one the other day.
Right.
And now it's on a couple of advertisements or here or there. You go, I go, oh crap.
Right.
I gotta go back and put this under the trade name.
Right.
Because you want it associated.
Correct. Exactly.
With
Right.
that. So, I don't know if anybody else is using that. I doubt that there is.
Right.
But
right.
It keeps. It
Right.
keeps the state in business every time I get the village money.
Absolutely, absolutely. They need those fees, those taxes, right?
I have a question about that. I found that there was another photos on the move period.
There was what?
There's another photos on the move. I'm photos on LLC. But
Okay.
I didn't know that someone else would use the same name because he spelled his now. And for whatever reason, because I've been trying to figure this out anyway with Facebook, my business account has been taken down 3 or 4 times during the pandemic.
On Facebook?
Facebook, and I did what Facebook said this last time.
Right.
And 3 days later, 4 days, said you've done something illegal. And I'm trying to figure out what I did
So
wrong.
photos, so the question is, there's another company, another LLC, another business with a very similar, the same name. So do you know if that business is using an LLC or a corporation?
No.
Okay, but yours is an LLC.
Yes, now, because I wasn't sole proprietor.
And are they doing business in Maryland?
There, I believe they're in Spain, but I'm not told.
Oh, in Spain they can do anything, you know. So,
I think, but-
so yeah. So what I was going to say, so a trade name that you register with the state, that isn't a trademark or a trade name that you register with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. That's completely different. So a trade name that you register with the state really isn't intellectual property. It is basically just your right to do business under that name. Okay, but when you register a trade name, you can what they call common law copyright or common law trademark that name. Basically what that means is you put the little TM on mine, and that means I'm saving this for myself. I've already registered it with the state, but if somebody starts using that within the state of Maryland, I could, if I wanted to, send them a cease and desist letter saying stop using it. I probably wouldn't, but I could. But it's not the registration with the state that allows me to do that. It's the claiming it as a common law trademark under the federal trademark laws that allows me to do that. That's a whole, that's about the level of my knowledge of intellectual property. But if you're dealing with a company that's not even in the state of Maryland and you've registered that just as a Maryland registration, then you don't have any control over what somebody in another state does. Now what could happen is even if you register that name in Maryland, let's say somebody did trademark that with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office somewhere in Nevada and saw that you are using that name, they can prevent you from using it because they got to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office first.
That happened here in Baltimore with Sony.
Oh, interesting.
There's a restaurant called Sony.
Ah.
Sony came and said, that's our trademark.
Right.
And that was the lady's name. They
Right.
said, we don't care.
Right.
We're Sony.
Right. Interesting.
She had to change the name.
Right.
You do the same thing with your internet names. I'm going to say, like I'll use Sugarloaf Photography, but there's another Sugarloaf Photography here in Maryland. But then I go up because I changed it to Sugarloaf Associates and used different trade names. I've associated that, so she can't get that. And so but she beat me to the internet and got it.
Oh, the domain name. Right.
So then I
Right.
became Sugarloaf Photography 1. And so
Right.
So I got a list on my website of all the internet names that I've protected. I've gone on either side of them,
Right.
and pick them up to say no one can grab that one,
Right.
to get around it, or for the future pick other ones up.
Right.
It's crazy. But
For
if you want to
the
protect
folks
your
on Zoom, a domain name, that's not a trade name, that's not trademark, that's just a domain name, completely separate. you want to make sure, if you're going to have a business name, that you can get the domain name first. I mean, because, yeah. I mean, if you're going to have a website, which most people are, right? Okay. So we've talked about sole proprietorships, I think. I mean, you asked a question about sole proprietorship versus LLC. So what you're going to have to do differently is you're going to have that separate bank account. You're not going to commingle funds. You're going to operate, as the LLC. You're going to have to file that $300 a year personal property tax return. But let me tell you, even if you're a sole proprietor, are you getting personal property tax bills?
No.
Okay.
I'm doing sales tax, but no.
Okay, so under state law, any business, whether you're a registered entity or not, legally owes personal property tax on all the personal property that it owns. Now, how does the state find out about you? They go through, used to go through the phone books, internet. They'll find businesses and find out that they're not registered as an entity. If they're registered as an entity, they've already gotten, they've already been connected with the state. If they're not registered, they'll get a request to file a personal property tax return. And if they don't, they can get penalties and taxes, and they can really add up. So technically, you're supposed to be filing those, but you haven't been discovered yet.
He's under the radar.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We've talked about LLCs, partnerships. I'm not going to go into much detail at all. A general partnership is basically two or more people who agree to do business together. That's pretty much what a partnership is. You can get much more complicated. There are very few reasons why you'd want to have a general partnership, because in a general partnership, the general partners are liable for all the debts of the business. So why would anybody do that these days when you can do an LLC? A corporation is a very different form of entity than an LLC. Because I've suggested that most people would want to form an LLC if you're forming your entity now. I'm not going to go into the corporation formation too much, but to say that it's much more complicated, because you've got to file the articles of incorporation, which includes a lot more information. You've got to indicate how many shares of stock the company can issue, how many directors are going to be on the board, who the officer, not who the officers and directors are going to be, but what officers there are going to be, what office positions they're going to be. A number of other things have to be set forth in the articles of incorporation. After those are filed, you have to prepare bylaws, and then you have to have an organizational meeting of the board, and you have to have minutes of that meeting, and then every year you have to have a shareholder meeting and a board meeting and have minutes of those meetings. And so it can become very burdensome. Most people, like me, don't keep up with that stuff. I mean, I don't even keep up with, because I don't have any major decisions that I'm making, on kind of a corporate level. So every year or two, or a couple of years, I go through and basically kind of bring everything up to date from my corporation. But if you have, a number of shareholders and different officers, all that has to be documented in your governing documents. And like I said, it can become very burdensome and sometimes unwieldy. And if you don't keep up with it, it can become problematic. Corporation is also not a pass-through entity. And so what happens when you have a regular corporation is the income or the revenue that comes into the corporation is taxed at a corporate tax rate. And then if a corporation decides to pay dividends to its shareholders, then the shareholders are taxed on the dividends that they receive. And that's why a corporate form of doing business is called double taxation, which is why a lot of people like the LLC form, because you don't have that double taxation. Yes?
How about associations? Do they even fall under anything that they have to do, to protect themselves?
What kind of associations, you said?
Any type of, for instance, our MDPPA.
I don't know, are you guys a corporation or a not-for-profit corporation? You're probably a not-for-profit corporation, a non-stock. Yeah, non-stock, not-for-profit. Right,
Probably on the
right.
website.
Right,
Yes.
we're protected under that.
Yes, and that this organization should be keeping up. I mean, with a not-for-profit organization, you've got this whole other level. You've got the board and the executive director. You don't have shareholders or stockholders. But yeah, you should definitely be keeping up with all those governing documents on a regular basis.
And are the people on the board, are they protected?
Protected. The question is, are the people on the board protected? There is a statutory immunity in Maryland law for directors and officers of not-for-profit organizations. That said, it's not a bad idea to have an insurance policy that covers D&O, directors and officers. Yeah. Okay, let's see. C Corp. So C Corp basically is a regular corporation that doesn't choose S Corp status. S Corp was put into the law probably like 40 years ago, before LLCs came about, to allow some corporations, some closely held corporations, small corporations, to have basically pass-through tax status. So if you're an LLC, if your entity is an LLC, your accountant might suggest you be taxed as an S Corp. But don't get mixed up and tell people you have an S Corp. You have an LLC taxed as an S Corp. I won't go into that any further. There's a side-by-side comparison here. If you get bored one day, you can look at this and look at the differences and the attributes of each of these types of entities. How are we doing on time? Okay, I mean, I can keep going, but if I don't have that much more, and I can go through this pretty quickly. Okay. Actually, we've gone through a lot of this already. So after you get notification that your entity has been formed, you can't get your EIN until you get that letter from the state. Get your EIN, your Maryland Combined Registration Number, open your bank account. When you go to the bank, take your articles of an organization or incorporation, the SDAT approval sheet, your EIN number, and your operating agreement if you have one. Set up a tax account with the comptroller's office. I think that's done around the same time that you get your combined registration number. That account is obviously for you to pay your sales taxes. Get your insurance, property and liability, general business insurance, and register as a foreign entity if you're doing business out of state regularly.
So what is the combined, I know the EIN, but what is the
So that is basically, I just call it like the state counterpart to the federal EIN. So you don't have to have, you technically don't have to have that combined registration number unless you have employees or you're paying sales tax. I don't have a need for an EIN. Well, actually, I didn't have a need for an EIN until I hired employees. But I should go ahead and get that number at the beginning, because the weird thing is, even though you can apply for it online, you actually get it in the mail. And, the state can take up to 3 weeks to get that letter to you. So when you apply for it immediately, and then just, wait. And, with the state delays and the U.S. Postal Service delays, you'll be lucky if you get it in 3 weeks. Okay. Trader's license. Do you all have trader's licenses? Okay. Do you sell goods?
Consider framed portraits.
Yes. So I believe a framed photograph would be a good. So technically, you should have a trader's license. A trader's license is only for a business that sells goods, not for a business that sells services. You guys do both, right? I don't sell any goods. I sell services, so I don't have a trader's license. You get your trader's license at the clerk of the circuit court for the county in which your business is located, or your principal office is located. Now, if you have a trader's license and you don't pay your personal property taxes, your trader's license can be revoked until you pay your personal property tax. I don't know what happens if you don't have a trader's license and you sell. I thought that I don't know. I guess when you establish your sales tax account, they don't ask if you have a trader's license. So
the state doesn't care because the trader's license isn't going to help them collect sales tax.
Exactly.
They're getting their sales tax, so
Correct.
They don't care.
Correct. So you know, that's a.
I imagine, I'm just assuming here, because I don't have one, but I'm assuming if you set up a booth, not a booth, a booth at a state fair.
Correct.
Or
yeah.
They're going to sit there and say, well, you can't set up this booth, let me see your trader's license.
That's correct. But if you're working, many of you, or most of you probably work out of your home-based studios, right? And so you don't necessarily have to have, you have to have it, but nobody's going to really look for it.
I do those and have never been asked.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sales use tax number is all they ever.
Yeah, because that's money, right? Check the zoning restrictions. I used to do a lot of zoning work, still do. You know, most of you are probably flying under the radar just in terms of home occupations, but you know, if you have a bigger practice, a bigger, you have clients coming in and out, several times a day, many times a day, several employees working for you, just check your local zoning regulations just to make sure that what you're doing is in compliance with zoning regulations. Most counties in Maryland are complaint-based violations, issue complaint-based violations. So you're not going to get a violation notice unless somebody complains. And who's going to complain? I mean, somebody might complain, right? But you're generally not going to get a violation notice unless somebody complains. But it's good to know because you don't want to be told to shut down. Mm-hmm.
Just an example, this has to do with photography, but a woman in the neighborhood was running a yoga studio out of her home.
Right.
And you had an extra garage created.
Right.
And the cars would pull there.
Right.
Park along the time. Then she get a complaint, and then the zoning notice went up.
Right. Right.
And then she had to close down.
Right. Right. So the comment was that somebody had to close down because they weren't in compliance with zoning because they were running a yoga studio. Same can happen with any kind of business. I got a little concerned because I had a part-time employee actually coming in, 2 part-time employees coming into my home-based office. And I think you can have like 1 full-time equivalent or something along those lines. Check the zoning regulations if you're really worried about it. If you're very low-key and, like I said, flying under the radar, don't get too concerned about it. Be
nice to your neighbors.
Be nice to your neighbors, yes, yes, that's right. Home occupation permit, I think some counties actually have like a home occupation permit. Howard County doesn't, you just have to either in compliance or not. Fire department, health department, those might or might not apply. Sign permits, Howard County has a really strict sign ordinance, believe it or not. I don't think if any of you are using home-based offices, you probably don't have a sign, and if you do, it's very small or should be very small. You want to check your HOA regulations, restrictions, those could impact. And then obviously you're doing any sort of building, construction, you need a building and construction permit.
If we do have a home area where we do our shooting,
right,
does that have to comply with business, for instance, exit signs? Do we have to have lit emergency exits to be able to comply with fire code?
That is a very good question.
Do we need to get inspected for that?
I think if you're a home occupation, I don't think there is a separate, at least not in Howard County, there's not a separate inspection. I think if you have kids, like daycare, that's a whole separate licensing division.
Before I forget, if you have a job and
right.
somebody pays you,
right.
let's say John Smith, and you take that check that says John Smith, and you put it into your private account or cash it, then they're no longer dealing with the LLC. So they gotta write John Smith LLC. You can't put that in your private account. It has to go into the LLC account. I know my bank won't allow me, you know.
If I get plenty of people writing checks to Catherine Taylor rather than Katherine L. Taylor, PA, I just endorse it, pay to the order of Katherine L. Taylor, PA.
Yeah. Okay.
And, you know, that's like, I'm paying it to the corporation and deposit it, and that's what I would do. I wouldn't put it into my personal account first, and then, you know, I would just put it, if it was really for a business-related purpose, I would just put it directly.
People get tempted because it's in your name to just put them.
Right, and if you mix that up, it's not going to be an issue. Your accountant, you know, will tell you how to, or your bookkeeper will tell you how to handle it if it even comes up. If you do that regularly, then that can be a problem.
So that is, sometimes people will write the check out to my name or to the business.
Right.
So it does make a difference whether or not, I mean, if they're doing it, if I have a wedding client, it'd be best to write it out to the business instead of to a person.
Yeah, so the question is, what do you do when you get a check made out to you personally if you do business in the name of an entity? And what I said I do, and what I would suggest, and probably an accountant or bookkeeper would suggest this too, is you can turn it over, endorse it, just pay to the order of Photos on the Move, LLC, and then sign it, you know, whatever your name is, sole member, and then deposit it, and that's a valid deposit into your business account. Yeah. And I've got that. I just had to email my accountant today for a very similar situation. Okay. Common contracts that you're going to encounter. Worker agreements. If you have employees or independent contractors, you're going to need to think about whether you need a written agreement. Generally for employees, you don't need a written agreement because the laws, the employment laws are so based on law already written down that you don't really have to spell out like what all the rights and obligations and duties are. If you have an independent contractor, make sure you have an agreement, a written agreement for that independent contractor. Client agreements, I'm sure you all have client agreements. I think the three most important provisions in a client agreement are who owns the images, and you can tell me if you agree with this, any releases that you need, and how to get paid, right? Some people leave out the how to get paid part, and that is so important because you don't want to be wasting your time chasing money that is owed you. Vendor agreements, you all have vendor agreements. Most of the time, those types of agreements aren't negotiable, but make sure you read them. It's amazing what you can get yourself into if you don't properly read an agreement, especially agreements that have like number of years, you know, terms can get very problematic. Yes.
Talking about 1099s.
Yes.
So let's say you have an assistant that works with you periodically, but you want them to be an independent contractor. Should you sign an agreement for them? And how does that affect the corporation from a liability standpoint?
Okay. So that's kind of a loaded question. So the question was, if you have a worker that works for you periodically,
Like an assistant.
An assistant, and you want them to be an independent contractor, do you have them sign a written agreement, and how does that affect the company? So this is going to be kind of a flippant response to begin with, but it's not you who decide whether they're an independent contractor or an employee. It's the law, right? And unfortunately for us, small business owners, we've got tax law, we've got the state workers' comp law, we've got unemployment compensation law, we've got contract law, we've got all these different types of law that can enter into this determination as to whether somebody really is an employee or not. Generally, if you have any control over their schedule, if you supply all of their, you supply all their supplies, the place to work, if you pay for their mileage, if you give them vacation time, I'm just going through all these potential factors. All those types of things will weigh in favor of that person being considered an employee. rather than an independent contractor. I've had a lot of clients within the last couple of years come to me and really ask to do kind of an analysis of their independent contractor agreements. And when we've gone through them, we've realized these are all employees in law, and they've switched them over to being employees, which is a pain because, you know, you're subject to the withholding, you know, the vacation time, Fair Labor Standards Act, minimum, just, you know, so many more laws. But what you don't want to have happen is to classify somebody as an independent contractor. And, you know, if you have a part-time assistant and, you know, that person is probably not going to file a complaint or, you know, request unemployment if they get fired. But let's say you have somebody like that you're treating as an independent contractor. They kind of think they're an employee, right? They get fired or they get laid off or they get hurt and they file for workers' comp or unemployment, and they go to the agency and they say, I'm an employee. And the agency comes to you and you say, no, they're an independent contractor. The agency says, I think they're an employee. You got to go back and do all of that withholding, pay penalties. It can be a nightmare.
So if, let's say I have a wedding and I just need another photographer to work with me for that wedding, I sign an agreement, you're independent.
Right.
You know, you're just doing this one job and I'm done.
Right. Question, if you just need an assistant photographer for a wedding and it's a person who you just, you know, is a freelancer, that clearly is an independent contractor. Yeah. So freelancers who work for other people, you know, that is like the best indication that they're really an independent contractor and not an employee, right? But you do want an agreement. It's a real tough and it's a real tough issue, and the state of Maryland is really starting to crack down on psychologists. And I think they're probably going through the various professions, but psychologists, you know, many psychologists' offices have have a lot of psychologists and therapists who are all independent contractors, and a lot of these businesses are having to change.
So if they're another business, do the agreement with the other business?
Yes, yeah. So if they have an LLC, that's the best case scenario. You do the agreement between your corporation and their LLC. Yeah. Commercial lease. Do any of you have commercial space? Oh, you do? Okay. So you've had to sign a commercial lease. That's a very long, arduous type of contract. My real advice is whenever you get presented with a commercial lease, if you have any questions, pay to have a lawyer review it, especially now, because this is a tenant's market. And so if you're trying to negotiate rent, security deposit, term, anything like that, it would probably be very worth it to pay somebody, you know, for a couple hours of time to negotiate some of the arduous terms out of the agreement and get some better terms. Okay, real quickly, I want to go through the sales tax issue, but okay, so generally, you know, kind of before the Wayfair case, if any business sells products or goods online, most businesses were only paying sales tax in the state in which the business was located. So if I'm in Maryland, Wayfair, I think, was in South Dakota. Wayfair wasn't paying sales tax when it sold me something. It was paying only South Dakota sales tax. South Dakota passed a law, probably because Wayfair is a huge entity, and South Dakota is not a big state, right? And so South Dakota passed a law basically saying that, basically said, so it doesn't, so in some respects it didn't necessarily apply to Wayfair, because maybe Wayfair wasn't located in South Dakota. I don't know. In any event, South Dakota passed a law basically saying goods that are sold in South Dakota to a South Dakota person are taxed by South Dakota. And so whoever's selling that good in South Dakota, whether they're located in North Carolina, Florida, or Nevada, has to pay that South South Dakota sales tax. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld the South Dakota law, and many states then started, and companies started changing their practices, much to the chagrin and disappointment of places like Amazon, right? So that might affect you all, because if you sell goods out of state, then you may be responsible for paying Pennsylvania or Virginia or DC sales tax.
Whiteford's Boston.
Pardon?
Whiteford's headquarters in Boston.
In Boston, okay, so it's just a way for South Dakota to get more money.
So let's say I have a website, SmugMug.
Right.
And I sell images on SmugMug.
Right.
And they're delivered to the client. SmugMug is paying charging taxes.
Okay.
Under Maryland, do I still have to pay those taxes if SmugMug took the taxes?
You got to deduct it.
So SmugMug you get paid from SmugMug?
Yeah.
So SmugMug collects the amount and then pays you?
No, they're taking care of it.
Yeah. Okay.
So like if I sell an image, let's say a portrait.
Right.
And it's going to be shipped to the client. They take 15% plus it takes the sales tax.
Okay, so they're collecting the sales tax.
So I don't have to worry about
That's
that.
right. Which is the good thing about using these online payment, these online platforms, right? Shopify and a lot of these online platforms will do a lot of that for you. You can indicate, obviously that, their software, their algorithms are going to know where taxes, is going to be charged. Okay. So sales tax of, let's say, framed photos, those are subject to, sales of framed photos are subject to sales tax, right? Okay. Right, it's always been true. Now, has it always been true, or have you always practiced the, if you sell photos as a result of a photo shoot, have you charged the sales tax on the entire,
Not in the state of Maryland.
or just on?
Yes, just on the
the actual product.
And the service was separate and not taxed. And I do know that DC has had that the other way for a long time.
So it's interesting because there's a footnote in this memo that I found that was written by the Comptroller's office that said that COMAR, which is a Code of Maryland Regulations, has historically applied the sales and use tax to charges for photography and video production to create photographs in tangible form, even if separately stated by the vendor. But I don't think that's been the practice, right?
It has not.
Okay. So, that's good because, so basically what happened is a new law was passed in Maryland. It's called House Bill 932 that basically applies sales and use tax to digital products. Okay, and there's this long list of what is a digital product. Well, the sale of a photograph, photostatic copy, or blueprint is a sale of tangible personal property subject to tax. So basically, photography, photos sent electronically are now subject to the digital sales tax. Okay, what is expressly stated in COMAR, in the new law, is that the services separate from the actual product, as long as they're separately charged and separately stated, the services are non-taxable. This memo from the comptroller seemed to indicate that this is a change from what is being done, but it sounds like at least what you guys are doing is this already. So under the new digital sales tax law, the same would apply. The digital portion of what you're selling would be subject to the sales tax, and then the services, so long as separately stated and invoiced, and there's actually an example.
So it is clear, it has to be invoiced separately? in order to-
Invoices separately. So this is an example, and I would suggest that you guys take this example and copy it, because this is from the comptroller's memo. Yeah.
The people in the chat know Catherine did provide the slides.
Yeah.
And so they're on the Facebook page, and we'll email them out to you.
Yeah, so the very last page of the slides is the example of what you need to do to make sure that your services are not subject to sales tax. Right. All right. That is the end. I'm assuming we don't have any more questions, because we had questions as we went through, which sometimes are easier, I think, to understand and answer. So thank you all. Zoom people.
No questions in the chat room, Bruce?
No, just like some angst for people who have self-proprietorships.
Well, they're changing that over. So, Catherine, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Guys, thank you all for coming out tonight. We will be back in session next month for our print competition, but that's going to be virtual. Yes, Chris Paul.
On her last point, it's kind of interesting. That's a strong justification for making sure you charge service only on weddings and similar kinds of things, and not include digital products within that fee.
Or you
Same
can
commercial session, and then the particular fees for the particular images.
To get electronic version of the proofs, in other words.
But it's a great justification to give the client that no, I can't throw in those digital images because
That's right.
I can't separate service from the product
Unless
that I'm going to deliver.
Free, but
So,
That's not going to happen.
right. Yeah, and you're not going to do that. But you're absolutely right. That is a really good, because many times you do need those justifications, right, when you're talking money with clients.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when we're doing a wedding contract, you have the service, my service of doing the wedding itself, which is not taxable.
Right.
But then if I sell an album, that's taxable.
Correct.
So we need to specify any products that are being sold to the client, and we have to specify in that contract,
Right.
you got to pay taxes on it.
Right. Because you might have people that you do wedding photography that don't order any photos, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be rare.
Not-
That would be rare. That would be really rare, but they don't have to. They don't have to. They still have to pay for you to be there and, spend your entire day.
We're getting paid.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that's a very good point.
So we
it's,
have to tweak my contract.
yeah. Well, use that example. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So.
All right, guys.
So
All right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.